This needs to be done quickly.
For most scale modelers, painting figures can be the stage that trips them up. Figure painting can either excite you or terrify you depending on what your expectations are. Today I'm taking a look at the new range from AK Interactive, and that's their Quick Gen line, to see whether these paints are really the quick and easy solution to figure painting, or if they don't live up to the hype. I'd been looking for an excuse to build these beautiful figures from the 2022 TAMIYA release, so now seemed like the perfect time to get them together and test out what these paints could do. The idea of an all-in-one speed style of paint solution stems back to 2019, when Games Workshop released their line of Citadel contrast paints. In saying that, the concept of painting with glazes dates back centuries, and that is essentially what we're talking about here, kind of. These paints are designed to work over a white or at least a light base to create their tones and colours. But like you have probably already seen with people painting using glazes, I'm creating a zenithal style of shading to set my foundations from. These figures are first primed in a black, and then a mix of white with a touch of ivory to add some warmth to the paint is added. I'm keeping the airbrush direction more or less over the top of the figure in the hope to simulate where the light may hit the shapes. By that way of thinking, those shadowed areas will remain in the darker colour. The deeper the recess, the more likely it would be to remain dark. I'll be using the set designed for World War II US uniforms for these figures, although I have a few other sets I'll be calling on as well. These quick paints come with their own glaze medium gel, of which I don't have, but I'm assuming it's a similar product to the glaze medium that I do have in the stash. This glaze medium will help extend the paint and should give me a greater transparency in the colour without affecting the coverage of the paint too much. This is the first time I've used these paints, so you are painting it here with me for the first time. When distributing the paint, it looked very dark to my eye, so I figured I could mix the standard AK acrylics in and tweak that colour a bit. I begin by adding a couple of drops of the US Olive Uniform colour from the Quick Gen line, a couple of drops of the glaze medium, and some of a colour called Faded Green, and begin to make a lightened mix to work with. I'm guessing by adding too much of that standard acrylic, it may tend to create more opacity in that colour and work against the properties of these speed paints. So I'm mindful to include that glaze medium into the mix to help extend that paint and keep it transparent. First coat on the pants, and you can immediately see the way this paint is working. The green tones of the paint are layering over the shadows and the highlights I'd created with the airbrush and giving me a pretty satisfactory result straight up. The way the paint behaves though is more than just a glaze, as it tends to want to settle into the recessed areas on the sculpt and enhance those sections with a deeper tone of the colour. A glaze can tend to be more reliant on the colour sitting below it and be more of a tint over the whole thing. I found breaking the figure up into individual sections and working methodically around the figure worked the best for me. It's also important to not try and overpaint a section while it is still wet, as this can potentially upset the coverage. Working around that figure and letting it dry before trying to add an additional coat seemed to be the best method. The paint dries fast, and a targeted second coat of that Quick Gen paint brings more of those green tones over the pants and settles into those shadowed areas to add more green into those areas. For the second figure, I tried to lighten that colour even more to create some variation between the two figures. To my eye, the pants were looking pretty good, and I was only 10 minutes into the paint session. Moving on to the jackets now, and I again look to lighten that Quick Gen colour by introducing ochre khaki to the mix. I guess the whole concept of this line is to not have to be mucking around with mixing colours, but while I was trying to get my head around how they work, this seemed to be the safest course of action. It's also worth noting I can confidently mix other true acrylics with this paint to modify the colours. These quick paints rely on the white colour underneath them, like I said earlier, to give them their colour and vibrancy, so it's important to keep your painting within the lines as you move through the parts over the sculpts. If you did happen to go over the lines, you could always brush paint the mistake with white to recreate the foundation for the colour that will follow. Again, working in sections around the jacket, I apply the paint. This time though, I'm purposely adding more paint coverage to the surface to try and promote that build up through the recesses. I found it quite amazing how well the paint covered and extended over the surface areas of the parts. It just seems to be an easy and fun way to paint without a lot of thinking required. To create even more depth, an undiluted mix of that ochre green was targeted in through the recesses to enhance some of the shadowed areas around the sculpt of the figure, and that worked to great effect. It was acting as a targeted pin wash of sorts and helped define the detail around the jacket. Dark leather could then be used for the boots. The US uniform set comes with only 3 colours, so if you're wanting to paint your figures with detailed gear, you're going to need to dip into the paint stash and create your own colours. For the webbing and pouches, a mix of cork brown and pale sand mixed with that glaze medium, and painting over the details could commence. I'm trying to maintain that glazed style of paint, hence I'm working with the glazed medium. However, painting these details in the traditional style would be more than acceptable. I understand there are flesh colours in this quick gen line, however I didn't have access to them, so I slipped into my usual style of painting flesh, and that is to set the foundations using a Citadel paint called Bugman's Glow, and then building up highlights with Acadian flesh tone, and then a lightened version of that for an even smaller surface area. I find that Bugman's Glow works well as a base for the shadowed areas in the flesh tones, particularly around the eye sockets and underneath the chin, and by keeping the lighter tones well thinned, I'm able to slowly graduate the colours through the shapes of the face. I'll definitely try the flesh tones with these quick gen paints, but for now I'm using what I have, and I will add a light oil wash to enhance some of the details around that face as well. It's here I would usually go to an oil wash over the figure, however I'm using the dark leather and a fine brush to outline the straps and define the belt. I appreciate all of these steps are probably moving the concept of speed painting further away from the whole point of the line, but 35th scale figures are such that little details can make a big difference to the figure, so a little extra work can really elevate your finish. I could then seal the paintwork with a coat of matte varnish, and I'm sorry but I couldn't help but add an oil wash to the flesh tones just to try and enhance some detail on the face. The same techniques were also used to paint a German soldier I'll be using in an upcoming build, and I found the more I worked with these paints, the better I seemed to understand how they work. I'd been painting away with a few other minis I had in the stash, and had been experimenting with different dilutions and coverages of the paint. A 3D printed Commonwealth tanker was treated with an undiluted mix of the Commonwealth uniform colour to great effect, although I think the black from the base coat was influencing that tone a little too much, and I put that down to a lesson learnt. I then grabbed a gaming mini and knocked that one out in probably around 30 minutes. I found the way the paint distributes tends to lend itself better to the surface areas on the smaller style of mini, like less work is required to get a satisfactory result. So with that in mind, I primed a few 72nd scale soldiers in pure white and painted them more or less from the colours straight from the bottles. I did thin them slightly with water, but these figures were painted in under an hour, and for a 72nd scale figure they should present in an acceptable way in a small scale diorama. The whole speed paint phenomena and style of painting is aimed towards the wargaming community looking to increase their output for their tabletop minis. This line from AK is actually a collaboration with Warlord Games, a name some of you will be familiar with in that wargaming space. I guess my motivation for this review was to see if this style of paint would translate into the space of the scale modeler, and particularly into that genre of 35th scale armour. Figure painting and 35th scale armour really do complement each other, but they really do require two unique skill sets to execute well, and as such, figure painting can intimidate some modelers. I found painting with these paints produced a really pleasing result with pretty little effort. The coverage was generous and predictable and required very little effort to generate depth and variation over the surfaces of the figure. The pre-packaged uniform sets make it easy to know what to buy for the figures that you're planning on painting, and when paired with the glaze medium and mixed with other acrylics, the possibilities are vast in terms of the colour gamut you can achieve. Are these paints the only style of paint you'll ever need? Well, no, that was never going to be the case, but they certainly can provide a foundation to create vibrant and adequate figures to complement your models. I found the paint led itself to the smaller scales a little better in the fact that it was almost a one-size-fits-all approach over those smaller surface areas, but as you saw, with a little effort I was able to achieve a pretty reasonable result on the larger scale figures. The quick gen paints may not suit the more traditional style of figure painter, but for those of you looking to dip your toe into adding figures to your models, it's a handy way to fast track your experience and get a feel for working with a brush on the figures. But enough from me. What do you guys think? Does the thought of figure painting intimidate you, or is it something you enjoy, or is it somewhere in between? I'd love to know, so let me know in the comments down below. And remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I will see you soon.
Interesting. That was quicker than the others.